invited Amy Gardner. Let me introduce Amy to you. Some of you, I understand, know her. I've received emails from some of you. Her title is long. I'm going to read this. Assistant Dean of Evaluation and Research and Associate Professor of Health Professions, Psychiatry, Surgery, and Education, Innovation, and Technology at Baylor College of Medicine. In these roles, she helps provide guidance to both trainees and faculty as it pertains to medical education research, faculty development, interprofessional education, simulation, and assessment. When I first heard of Amy when I was reading literature on situational judgment testing and how she's utilized this to assess attributes for GME selection. Her background, she received a master's degree and doctorate in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Akron, Ohio. Amy, we're delighted to have you join us today, so welcome.
Thanks so much. Let me, of course, share my screen and then confirm that you can see it. All good?
Perfect.
Great. So thank you for that kind introduction. I am an industrial organizational psychologist, so this is what we do. So I hope that you'll find this informative. And I am admittedly horrible at monitoring the chat as we go. So I'd encourage you, if you have questions about anything that I'm presenting, just hop in. Disclosure-wise, I did mention I'm co-founder of SurgeWise, which provides advice on selection and assessment to surgical training programs and organizations, and you can see our mission here. And I first want to talk to you a little bit about kind of my journey to here today. So I entered the medical education world about 10 years ago, doing training and assessment work in a regional simulation center in Ohio, and then ended up in a pretty large surgery department doing both simulation and assessment within the surgical training programs. And while in this role, I quickly noticed that a substantial amount of time and resources was being spent on the residency selection process, with surgeons spending lots of hours manually poring over piles of applications and interviewing hundreds of candidates, often to fill just a handful of positions. What I also noticed in my role is that despite all of the investment in time and resources, these efforts weren't always working in terms of identifying those candidates who would really thrive in our program. So because I had a role in trainee assessment, I was the one who was tasked with creating customized remediation programs or performance improvement plans when trainees kind of got off track. And, I was shocked and sometimes admittedly mildly annoyed at how it was never the book smarts or the technical skills that seemed to trip up our trainees. Instead, it was the professionalism and then the interpersonal skills and things like that that really seemed to be a struggle for some folks. On top of that, I also observed that a substantial proportion of trainees selected in our program just really didn't even make it to graduation. They're leaving for other programs, other specialties, and sometimes medicine entirely. So after reviewing the literature and databases that really track these type of data, and also talking to friends at other surgery programs, I learned that it wasn't just us, that this was really a national problem. So while at a conference and talking to one colleague about this from another program, was kind of expressing my woes and frustrations, and I mentioned to him the field of industrial organizational psychology. And I really told him, this is really the field that focuses on the scientific study of the workplace and all the things that occur throughout the employment life cycle, and that really as a community, we could benefit from adopting a thing or two from the world of IO-Psych, especially as it pertains to selection. And as I mentioned, this is my background, and selection is really one of the pillars of our field, originating back to World War I, where the military called upon psychologists to help them identify candidates who would be best suited for missions abroad and those with high leadership potential. And since then, selection science has rapidly expanded to cover a number of areas related to selection, resulting in a broad literature base, professional guidelines, and really some best practices and how to select individuals that best fit your organization in the most fair, efficient, and evidence-based manner. So after hearing about this, my colleague and I decided to partner up. And we applied the latest evidence in selection science to his fellowship program. And we actually had some pretty nice results. And so after that, we decided, well, wouldn't it just be fun and a little bit more impactful to work with some of our friends at other programs? So this led to the creation of SurgeWise, which is a consulting firm where we partner with individual programs to help them develop customized screening and assessment solutions to really move the needle on adopting a more efficient, equitable, and evidence-based selection process. So I want to just kind of give you some perspective on the data and experiences that I'm about to reference in my later slides. So to date, we've had almost 10,000 assessments completed by applicants across a number of surgical subspecialties. And in most of these specialties listed, we're able to capture, on average, across all of them, about 80 to 85% of all applicants to the field. And these experiences have really offered a great window into the diversity and culture of different programs, not only across specialties or across the country, but even programs within the same city. And one assessment that I was asked to speak to you about, but one that we've found to be quite beneficial in this process, is a situational judgment test. So you're likely already familiar, especially as this was referenced, I know at your last workshop quite a bit because I was able to peek. But SJTs are those hypothetical but realistic scenarios presented to applicants where they have to rate the effectiveness of a variety of responses that you provide that they might could take it in response to that situation, and or even write in responses that they might take kind of free form. So the advantage of this is you're able to simultaneously give candidates a realistic preview into what they might experience if they were to join your program, an organization, but you're also able to get almost the equivalent of a work sample, which I know Dr. Moss showed you how important those were, but you're almost able to get the equivalent of a work sample from them and better insight into how they might respond in real life. So we have a database of almost 1,000 unique SJTs that we've been able to kind of pilot and administer across the country. And we found that overall, they're incredibly beneficial for postgraduate medical education selection, and for a number of reasons. So sometimes this is a blessing and sometimes it is a curse, but they're multidimensional. So they allow you to assess a number of different competencies at once. They're also hard to game or fake, which is incredibly important for, I know, all of us who are working with highly motivated and competitive candidate pools. As I mentioned, they can help give applicants a realistic job preview. I'll speak to this a bit later as well, but if created thoughtfully, and that's why I have an asterisk there, and with the proper checks throughout the validation process, we found that they can actually help increase the diversity of the candidates considered, especially in comparison to things like standardized test scores, letters of recommendation, and those unstructured interviews that often don't buy you a lot. And then we've also been able to measure their ability to predict outcomes a few years out, which I'll speak to in a moment, and we found some pretty nice relationships there. So I know you're quite familiar, but you know, we're not alone in seeing the value in incorporating SJTs into the medical education environment. You know that the AAMC is working on some of this. The UK already has some SJTs built into their standardized assessments that are required for entry into medical education training. Scholars at McMaster have created a version of an SJT called Casper that's been widely used in Canada and states for entry into undergraduate medical education. And if you want to be a surgeon of any type in Australia or New Zealand, you have to complete an SJT through RACS, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. But what I wanted to share with you today is a handful of lessons that we've learned along the way that may be of benefit to you as you potentially consider going down this route. So the first question that I just like to get out of the way and discuss head on is a question that we get all the time, which relates to the idea of creating one universal SJT assessment that everyone within a specialty or maybe an organization can use. And I know that the thinking of this is pretty logical, you know, thinking, well, if we're all in the business of training the same type of residents or at least at the same institution, then surely we all want and value the same competencies from entering trainees. So in fact, this was one of the inspirations for a Texas-wide consortium we helped create back in 2018 called FitBest, where we gathered a handful of general surgery programs and went through the job analysis and test development process with each of them to try and create one SJT that everyone could use for screening applicants. So that if an applicant applied to any of these 5 programs that were participating, they just completed one SJT. And the programs might use it in different ways. And it didn't take very long for us to see that one tool wasn't really going to be able to capture each program's idiosyncratic demands, values, and culture. And in fact, when we gave the programs our preliminary assessment tool that had 50 plus scenarios and other items on it, programs really ended up agreeing on how they'd want a candidate to respond on just 2 of those items. But I think when you think about this, this kind of one shared universal tool, I think our results and kind of findings make sense. Although training programs within a specialty may be held to the same accreditation standards, the institutional climate can greatly impact the competencies required for success at any given program. So for example, programs vary in the extent to which residents are expected to participate in research or teach medical students or maybe care for patients in a rural setting. And then on a more subtle level, programs also differ in their promotion of diversity and inclusion, focus on innovation, provision of autonomy, and then emphasis on other norms and values. And it's these aspects that are really what build that unique training environment and those cultures around us. And that can heavily impact the norms and expectations placed upon trainees. So in our experience, at least, creating one universal tool to cover a whole specialty or maybe multiple specialties within a single organization is going to be very limited in the amount of info that you can get from applicants, and then also isn't going to be super helpful for the applicants themselves to really learn about each program to which they're applying. Plus, as kind of a 1B, I can imagine that one universal tool that is used nationwide or even specialty-wide would have some serious test security issues. Again, with the highly motivated and competitive population of applicants we're dealing with, everyone's looking for an opportunity to perform well and have a leg up on their peers. So test security for just one tool, even if you're refreshing items and such, would still be a major issue. And of course, you have to acknowledge and know that if there is one SJT that's used by a whole specialty, those test prep companies are certainly going to be ready to take advantage of that, as they already are with that UK version of SJT I mentioned, the CASPER and other universal SJT assessments. Another thing that I think is important to note about creating SJTs is that it can actually be pretty involved. So they're not those straightforward, knowledge-based MCQs that I know many of you have experience with. There's actually kind of a lot of important details and decision points that you have to be really thoughtful about when creating them. So for example, coming up with a dilemma or complex situation, usually isn't too difficult, but refining it in a way that's measuring specific competencies while simultaneously giving your applicant a realistic preview into your program can be a bit tricky. And knowing when to write these scenarios in the first person and pros and cons versus when to write them in third person and pros and cons really requires some intentionality and some kind of research. At this point, modality is a kind of a decision point here too. So is it a written SJT? Is it a video-based SJT? Is it some other animated form? Because there's a whole line of literature highlighting kind of the pros and cons and of each of those decision points. Choosing what type of instructions you use is an important decision point as well. So, keep in mind that there are nerdy PhDs who have built their whole careers on doing research on the very fine details of SJT development. So there's research showing, what cognitive processes you tap when you use instructions that are like, what would you do versus what should you do, and what happens when you use both in the same assessment. So that's some consideration. In my experience, creating the actual responses that candidates rank or rate in response to the situation or dilemma presented can be quite complex as well. So keep in mind that with SJTs, the goal is that there are no clearly wrong or no clearly right answers. And there should be a world and environment in which each response is the most effective response. So crafting these can be a difficult exercise. There are also decisions to make in terms of how you want the candidate to respond to the scenario. So, for example, are they rating the effectiveness of all of the handful of responses that you presented them? Are they ranking them in some sort of order from highly effective to least effective? Or do you give them any responses at all? Or do you just make them kind of type in or write in and just tell you what they would do? How to score them is complex, and I'll just leave it at that. There are literally entire textbooks talking about the various different ways you can score SJTs and the research behind them. And then finally, we have to think about what do you do about response patterns? We know from the literature, and we found in our work as well, that there are often distinct response patterns across demographic groups, with some groups feeling a little bit more comfortable on average than others at endorsing the extremes. So you kind of need to plan for how to handle this in advance. So I don't point out these things to overwhelm you. I just want to highlight the nuances and subtle complexity that exist in the SJT development process. Another thing we found is that there are sometimes some very real fears among many programs that doing anything outside of the norm, such as requiring an SJT assessment, is going to scare away the good applicants. So for example, even though in general surgery, 99.7% of all programs match all of their positions each year, it's not uncommon for PDs that we speak to fear that doing anything different than the other programs or a program across the street will turn away competitive applicants. Our data suggests otherwise. So at the residency level, our most recent data shows that 97% of all applicants invited to complete an SJT assessment as part of their application will do so. For fellowship positions, the number varies a bit more, anywhere from low 90s to 100% based on surgical subspecialty, but still quite high. And we really, despite our best efforts, been unable to identify really any discernible pattern in that 3 or 4% of candidates who choose not to complete an assessment when they're asked to do so. I think it's important to note as well that when you think about kind of this issue or this potential issue, in our work we see that we have 0%, so it's really like 0.0001% test abandonment. So meaning essentially no applicants clicking on an SJT assessment that they're asked to complete, kind of see what it's asking or what's involved, and then decide the program is absurd or something and just doesn't complete it and kind of exits out. So I don't think, based on these data, that we need to be worried about doing anything different or requiring an SJT as part of the application process is going to scare anyone away from your program or the specialty. We've also found that traditional screening techniques and tools may be hindering our ability to create a diverse workforce, as I know many of you know, but SJTs can actually help. So I know this isn't much of a surprise for many of you who know this literature, but some of the top few things that we use to initially screen in candidates, like exam scores, personal statements, letters of recommendation, and those unstructured interviews, all can have incredibly high levels of bias enveloped within them, impacting substantial demographic differences in test performance and ratings that are not matched in later job performance. Fortunately, though, we've been able to demonstrate that relying on tools like an SJT, again developed through that rigorous test development process for the purposes of selection, can help increase the diversity of the workforce. And there are a lot of nuances here. So things like making sure that there's a diverse group of individuals who are informing the development of the SJT, making sure, again, that it's a diverse team of individuals involved in kind of the scoring and creating that scoring algorithm, making sure that you're going through kind of some sensitivity reviews, assessing and kind of rating a couple things for each SJT, things like that. All of that kind of stuff still needs to happen at a pretty intricate level to make sure that you're really maximizing the utility for these tools, not only to predict, future performance, things like that, but not to disadvantage individuals from any background or group. And then finally, of course, the success of any selection tool should be its ability to predict the extent to which trainees perform well and really thrive during training. And of course, complete the training program. So we've been able to measure this in a couple of different ways. So in one institution, we were able to perform what we call a concurrent validity study. So after creating the SJT, the program actually administered it to all of their current trainees across postgraduate years and linked it to their unique multidimensional performance equation that factored in things like in-training exam scores, faculty rotation evaluations, case logs, administrative compliance, research activity, and then the medical student teaching evaluation. So they kind of had all that data ready and weighted in a way that they kind of had an overall success formula for their trainees. And what we found is that the SJT predicted overall performance above and beyond any other screening tool or ratings that the program had used to select these trainees in. In another study, we performed a 2-year follow-up, showing again that the SJT was uniquely valuable, especially in comparison to SMLE scores and other application data, in predicting remediation frequency and individuals who would leave the program. And then this one's a bit different, but this is a study that one of the programs we worked with did independently of us. And so what they did is they used kind of the signal detection framework, and they compared how well the SJT predicted future remediation and attrition in their program, kind of aligning with this framework, and compared it to how well their own faculty could predict who would need remediation or who would end up leaving the program in subsequent years. So as you see in the matrix, a hit was someone who scored well on the SJT and had no remediation issues or attrition. A miss is someone who scored poorly on the SJT but didn't have any remediation or attrition in those follow-up years. A false alarm is someone who the SJT predicted to be a great trainee but either required some remediation or ended up leaving the program. And then that correct rejection is someone who the SJT predicted would be a great fit for the program and did end up requiring remediation or leaving the program. So what this program found is that the SJT was about 3 times less likely to raise a false alarm and about 2 to 3 times more likely than faculty to predict a correct rejection. And then finally, I'll share with you our most up-to-date database and hopefully some soon-to-be published data if we get our stuff together. But this is looking across programs and across postgraduate years, the ability of SJTs to predict performance in training as measured by the GME milestones. So what you see here are each of the 6 milestone areas that I know you're quite familiar with as program directors, as well as an overall average for the milestone ratings. And each of these are standardized within PGY here, because obviously PGY2s should perform a little bit higher on the milestone ratings than PGY1s, and also standardized within program. So the 0 is going to be the average milestone rating for that program that resident is in, and kind of compared to their peers of the same level. And so these data represent 4 different groups of trainees who completed one of our assessments, or was asked to complete one of our assessments, and are now in training. So those color groups represent those different groups. So the green are the individuals who performed well on that program's SJTs. The yellows performed kind of middle of the road. The reds performed poorly on that program's SJT, and the grays are the unknowns. And so let me break that down a little bit for you. So the unknowns are trainees who, one, were either asked to complete an SJT as part of their application package and didn't, but somehow were selected in either, selected in kind of regardless, or a candidate who was referred to a program for an interview from a program director friend, for example, at another program. And so they essentially got to skip ahead of the line to interview without completing one of our assessments, and based on how they interviewed, got selected in. So these data represent the accumulation of those biannual milestone reports that you turn in the winter and summer each year to the GME for the past 2 years, and standardized again by postgraduate year and program. And what you see is that on average, across the board, those greens, so again, those are the candidates who did well on that SJT for that program that they ended up joining, are outperforming their peers across competencies. The yellows perform a bit worse than the greens on average, and the reds perform a bit worse than the yellows on average. And then you see that the grays aren't doing very well either. So again, those are those unknown candidates. But overall, still not performing better than many of their peers. So in summary, SJTs have a lot of real potential in the postgraduate medical education selection world. They can help increase the diversity of trainees that you select in, especially in comparison to what's often used. They can help provide a realistic preview for candidates who may enter your program to kind of the norms, values, and expectations of a trainee. They can help predict remediation and performance and attrition, as I highlighted. And then for these reasons, I encourage you to really think about the value that SJTs may bring to your program, maybe partner up with someone who has some expertise and experience in SJT development, and see what the possibilities might be for your program. And of course, I would encourage you to collect lots of data along the way so that we can it can be shared and we can really continue to learn from one another. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time and invitation to chat with you today. Happy to connect and chat further about any questions you may have about the work I mentioned or any other lessons learned or experiences that you think you might be interested in learning more about.